I want you to try a thought experiment with me to really kick things off today.
Okay, I'm ready.
And welcome to the deep dive, by the way. I'm your host, and I've got our resident expert here with me.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here to unpack all these sources with you.
So, uh, this thought experiment, it is going to be a little uncomfortable for you listening, but I really need you to stay with it. I want you to picture a very specific character.
Like a fictional character.
Well, we see them in movies all the time, like think of the guys in Wall Street or think of the family in Succession. But let's be honest, if we look around, we see them in real life too.
Oh, right. The person everyone just loves to hate, but also kind of secretly watches.
Exactly that person.
Hmm.
Imagine someone who is just absolutely ruthless in business. They cheat when they need to. They lie without even blinking. They exploit people to get ahead. And frankly, they seem to have zero genuine concern for the well-being of anyone but themselves.
Sounds charming.
Right. And here's the kicker. They're incredibly rich. They're incredibly powerful. And when you look at them, they seem totally satisfied.
Yeah, it's the classic archetype of the successful villain. It is a staple of our culture for a reason.
Right. And if you could somehow hear their internal monologue, I really don't think it would be full of guilt or shame. I think it would be something like, I built an empire, I won, I get exactly what I want, when I want it, my life has a point, my life is meaningful.
And that statement right there, that possibility, it makes us really uncomfortable, doesn't it?
It really does. It kind of makes my skin crawl just saying it out loud.
It creates a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance for us because we have this deep-seated assumption, almost like a reflex, that a good life must equal a morally good life.
Yeah, we really want the universe to work that way.
We do. We want to believe that if you are a bad person, your life is inherently empty or miserable. Psychologists call it the just world fallacy. We desperately want to believe the wicked are automatically punished with misery.
But then you open a history book. Or you just, I don't know, scroll through the business news or look at the nonfiction bestsellers list.
And the illusion totally cracks. History is absolutely littered with counterexamples. You have these charming villains, brilliant but totally criminal masterminds, artistically gifted geniuses who were just incredibly cruel to their families,
Yeah.
and highly successful leaders with terrible ethics. And based on the biographical sources we're looking at today, they didn't seem to be wallowing in misery at all. They were often vibrant, active, and fully engaged.
So today, for this deep dive, we are going to tackle something that might feel a little dangerous. We're looking at a bunch of philosophical essays,
Yeah.
psychological studies on well-being, and historical character studies, and our mission is to strip away the easy answers.
No softballs today.
Exactly. We aren't asking if bad people can be rich. I mean, we know that. We aren't even asking if they can be happy. We'll get to that in a second. We are asking the core question here. Is moral goodness necessary for a meaningful life? Or can a morally bad person still live a life that is, in some real tangible sense, completely meaningful?
And just to set the stakes here for you listening, this isn't just some abstract philosophical puzzle to solve over coffee. This challenges how we define success, how we raise our kids, and honestly, what we are actually chasing in our own lives.
Yeah, because if a bad person can have a meaningful life, what does that say about the value of being good?
Oof, that's a heavy question.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can decide if a villain's life is meaningful, we probably need to look at the text and agree on what the word meaningful actually means, because I think people mix that up with happy or successful all the time.
They do constantly, and that conflation is exactly where the confusion starts. To navigate this, the source material suggests we have to separate what philosophers often call the holy trinity of well-being.
The holy trinity of well-being. Okay, what are the three parts?
Happiness, success, and meaning. They are not the same things at all, though we often use the words totally interchangeably in casual conversation.
Okay, let's break them down one by one. Let's start with happiness. If I am that ruthless CEO we just imagined, can I be happy?
Unquestionably.
Really?
Yes. If we define happiness as a psychological state, so feeling pleasure, feeling comfort, satisfaction, a lack of stress, then absolutely yes. A bad person can feel all of that.
Right.
You can cheat your way to a fortune and enjoy the champagne just as much as an honest person, maybe even more actually, because you aren't spending any time worrying about who you stepped on to get it.
Right, the champagne tastes the exact same regardless of where the money came from. The bubbles don't just go flat because you stole the bottle.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's happiness. What about success?
Even easier to answer. Success is usually an external metric. Did you achieve your goals? Did you gain status? Do you have money and influence?
Yeah, the stuff you can measure.
Exactly. A bad person can clearly achieve this. In fact, if we look at the historical analyses in our sources, sometimes their sheer lack of scruples makes it easier to achieve these things quickly. They don't have the speed bumps of morality slowing them down.
So a bad person can be happy and they can be successful. That brings us to the elusive third category, meaning. How is that different from the other two?
Meaning is much heavier. It suggests a life that feels deeply worth living, not just enjoyable in the fleeting moment. It connects to values or purposes that extend way beyond trivial pleasures.
Like having a purpose.
Right, it has coherence,
Yeah.
like a story that makes sense. And it usually involves leaving some kind of lasting mark. It is the difference between eating a really great meal, which is happiness, and raising a child, which is meaning.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Raising a child is often incredibly stressful and exhausting, right?
Yeah.
So it's not always a happy experience in the moment, but it is deeply, deeply meaningful.
I want to stay on this distinction between success and meaning for a second, because I feel like our culture is just specifically designed to blur that line. We are constantly sold the idea that they're identical.
It absolutely is. We live in a society that heavily prizes external validation. We are taught straight from kindergarten that the gold star is the meaning, the grade is the meaning.
Get the A, get the promotion.
Exactly. The promotion is the meaning. We completely confuse the badge for the actual journey.
Right. Because if you ask someone, hey, how is your life going? They almost immediately start listing off their resume to you. Oh, work is great. I just got a huge raise. We bought a new house.
Yeah.
They rarely ever say, my life is going great because I feel a deep sense of coherence and moral purpose.
If they said that at a dinner party, people would probably look at them like they were an alien.
Total.
But that highlights the core problem our sources are pointing out. We treat success, the pure accumulation of goods and status, as a proxy for meaning. But they're fundamentally different mechanisms. Success is about accumulation. Meaning is about connection and expression.
Accumulation versus connection. That is a really helpful heuristic to keep in mind.
Right.
You can accumulate a massive pile of money while being completely disconnected from everyone around you.
Exactly. Think of it kind of like a library. Success is having the most books. You can steal books, you can buy books, you can hoard books in a giant room, you have the biggest library in town. That is success.
Okay, and meaning.
Meaning is, have you actually read them? Do you
Yeah.
understand them? Have you shared the stories in those books with anyone else? You can be a totally bad librarian who just hoards books and screams at people to stay away, and you are technically successful by the metric of volume.
Right, you have the most books.
But there is zero meaning in a hoard. A hoard is just a pile of stuff.
And I think that is exactly why we see those classic midlife crises for the successful villain types. They get all the way to the top of the mountain, they have all the books, and they look around and realize, wait, I'm just a warehouse manager.
And that profound emptiness they feel in that moment, that is the absence of meaning. They have the trinity of happiness, the pleasure and success, the status, but the third leg of the stool is missing, and so the whole thing wobbles.
So, the mission for this deep dive is to move past that easy question of whether they can be happy and really hit the hard one. Can a life be truly meaningful if it is morally bad?
Precisely. And the philosophical text we're using suggests we need to look at this from two very different angles to be intellectually honest with ourselves. First, we need to make the case for yes. We need to really try to understand how a bad life could be considered meaningful.
Okay.
And then we need to look at the argument for no.
All right, I'm ready to play devil's advocate here. Let's look at the affirmative argument first. Yes, a bad person can live a meaningful life.
Yeah.
How do the sources justify that?
Well, if you look at the research and the philosophical arguments, one of the strongest definitions of meaning they offer is intensity and commitment.
Meaning as intensity.
Right. This specific view says that meaning comes from being deeply committed to something that actually matters to the individual and then structuring your entire life around it. It is about being an active agent in your own story. It's the exact opposite of passivity.
So if I am a ruthless business tycoon and I wake up every single morning at 4 a.m. with this just burning desire to destroy my competition and build the biggest skyscraper in the city, that is commitment.
It absolutely is. Think about the entire structure of that life. It isn't passive at all. It isn't aimless. A morally bad person can be wholeheartedly devoted to building a company, mastering an art form, or pursuing immense political power.
Yeah.
From the outside, we might judge the goal as bad, but from the inside, that person has incredible focus. They have passion. Their life has a clear narrative arc. I am the conqueror.
That is a really interesting point to make. It completely prevents the feeling of drifting. I think a lot of people listening might feel their lives lack meaning sometimes simply because they're just floating, watching TV, going to a job they don't really care about.
Drifting is the enemy of meaning.
But the villain is never drifting. They are always on a mission.
Exactly. And that subjective experience of being on a mission provides an incredibly powerful sense of meaning to them. It completely distinguishes them from someone who is bored or listless. Even if their only goal is to crush a business rival, that goal gives them a solid reason to get out of bed. It organizes their time and their energy.
I want to dig a little deeper into this idea of intensity providing meaning, because I think there's something oddly seductive about the obsessed genius or the ruthless commander trope. Why are we as a culture so drawn to that?
The psychology sources point out that it's because the human brain deeply craves order and narrative. Chaos is the ultimate enemy of meaning. When we look at a bad person who is incredibly focused, let's say a corrupt politician who works 20 hours a day to pass a specific law that secretly benefits them, we see order.
They aren't confused about what they want. They know exactly what they are doing every minute.
Correct. And for the person actually living it, that total removal of ambiguity is incredibly satisfying to the brain. It generates a flow state. Are you familiar with the concept of flow?
Yeah, flow states.
Yeah.
Where you completely lose track of time because you're just so engrossed in the task at hand.
Exactly. Well, the research shows that flow states are highly correlated with a deep sense of meaning. And here's the real kicker. Flow is morally neutral.
Morally neutral?
Yes. You can be in a flow state while painting a beautiful masterpiece, and you can be in the exact same flow state while planning a complicated bank heist. The brain releases the exact same dopamine. The intense focus feels exactly the same.
That is actually terrifying when you think about it. So the brain doesn't have a built-in moral filter on the feeling of meaning.
Not on the immediate feeling of engagement, no. If you are the villain and you are right in the middle of a high-stakes negotiation where you are bluffing and cheating and actively crushing your opponent, you feel alive. You feel electric.
Wow.
And if you ask that person in that exact moment, hey, is your life meaningful? They would shout yes, because they are being fully utilized. Their skills are being pushed to the absolute limit.
It's the thrill of the hunt, even if you're hunting something you really shouldn't be.
Exactly. So when we look at the argument that, yes, they can have a meaningful life, we are acknowledging that biological and psychological reality. We cannot deny that the adrenaline and the intense focus literally feel like meaning to them.
Because to say otherwise is just ignoring how human psychology actually works.
Right. We aren't wired to only feel good when we do good deeds. We are wired to feel good when we overcome complex challenges.
Even if the complex challenge is, how do I hide this body? Or how do I successfully embezzle this pension fund?
It is dark, but yes, the problem-solving circuitry in the brain lights up the dashboard of meaning completely, regardless of the morality of the problem itself. So that's argument number one from the text. Meaning equals focus and passion, regardless of what that passion is directed at.
Okay, I see that. I can definitely feel the pull of that argument. Now let's look at argument number two for the yes side. The sources call this one meaning as impact.
Impact, yes. This is the leaving a mark idea. Many people, when asked, define a meaningful life as one that significantly changes the world, one that has historical significance. And here's the very uncomfortable truth the historians point out. Impact is not inherently positive.
Right. You can leave a dent in the universe, like Steve Jobs said, but you can also leave a scar. And a scar is still a mark.
Precisely. A tyrant, a criminal mastermind, a totally ruthless revolutionary, they unquestionably shape history. They change the lives of millions of people. If you look at the sheer weight of their life, it is incredibly heavy. It is undeniably significant.
Yeah.
Now compare that to someone who lives a perfectly moral, quiet life, never hurts a single soul, but also never really does anything that affects anyone outside their own house.
That is the classic nice guy versus great man dilemma in history. It's really unsettling to admit, but if we are actively measuring meaning by the metric of how much did you matter to the story of the world, the villain often matters way more than the innocent bystander.
It creates a philosophical situation where we have to say, this person was objectively evil, but their life was highly significant. And if meaning is fundamentally about significance, then yes, they lived a very meaningful life. They were a major protagonist in the story of the world.
I could see that.
That's
It is kind of the difference between watching a movie about a daring bank robber and a movie about a guy just sitting there watching paint dry. The robber is bad, but his story is intensely meaningful. It has massive stakes. The other guy's just boring. We inherently equate high stakes with high meaning.
So if you sum up the yes side of the debate, if meaning is about how it feels to the person, that subjective intensity, and what they leave behind the impact, then a morally bad person can absolutely, unequivocally hit those marks.
Okay, I am really feeling the sway of that argument now. It appeals to the part of us that just naturally admires competence and drive, even when it's scary to look at. But I can see you checking your notes over there. You're ready to flip the table on this.
I am, because while that argument absolutely holds water on a surface level, there is a very strong, very deep philosophical tradition in our sources that says, no, that is not real meaning.
All right, let's hear it. Let's look at the negative argument. Why is the villain's life not meaningful?
The first major counterargument revolves around this concept of meaning and moral reality. This view argues that you cannot just invent meaning out of thin air. Meaning isn't just a subjective feeling you happen to have. It is about actively connecting with what is truly objectively valuable in the universe.
So you can't just decide, my ultimate meaning in life is to stack these rocks in a pile and have that be truly meaningful just because you focused really hard on it.
You could feel like it's meaningful, but most of these philosophers would say you are fundamentally mistaken. You are essentially delusional. Now let's raise the stakes back to our villain. If you build your entire life on exploitation, cruelty, or domination, you are orienting your one and only life toward things that are objectively destructive or low.
The sources call this the distortion theory, right?
Exactly, the distortion theory. If human reality is built on connection, trust, and mutual dignity, and you actively build your life on destroying those exact things, your life project is fundamentally at odds with reality itself.
Wow.
It is like dedicating your life to building a magnificent towering castle, but you are building it inside a virtual reality simulation while your actual physical body sits in a chair and starves to death.
That is a haunting image. So the argument here is that the villain's life might be highly dramatic, and it might be incredibly powerful, but it isn't deeply meaningful because it is based on a massive error. They are basically spending their whole life chasing fool's gold.
Right. They are dedicating their specific precious time on Earth to things that do not actually matter in the grand scheme of things, feeding their ego, asserting dominance, hoarding infinite resources. It is ultimately a wasted life, even if it was a very busy one.
That makes a lot of sense. And it leads right into the second negative argument, which I find really fascinating.
Yeah.
The psychological cost. We talked earlier about how the bad person might be happy and have that constant dopamine hit of success, but the texts ask, is that happiness brittle?
Yes. This is the argument of inner corruption and self-deception. We have to think about what is actually required to maintain a morally bad life over decades. Unless you are a literal clinical psychopath, which is a whole other medical conversation entirely, most people possess a conscience.
Right.
So to be ruthless, to constantly exploit people, you have to actively and aggressively suppress that conscience.
You have to constantly lie to yourself. You have to say things like, well, they deserved it, or it's just business, nothing personal, or I had absolutely no choice in the matter.
Precisely. You have to constantly numb your own empathy. You have to avoid any honest self-reflection at all costs, because if you really sat down and looked in the mirror, you would hate the person staring back at you. So over time, this leads to a severe state of inner fragmentation.
You were literally fracturing your own psyche just to keep the game going.
And the philosophers ask, can a life built on massive, continuous self-deception ever be called meaningful? The no side says that is completely impossible. A truly meaningful life requires truth. It requires actually knowing who you are.
Yeah.
If your entire life is just a performance designed to hide your own cruelty from yourself, it is, in the words of one thinker in our source packet, full of excitement but empty of truth.
Full of excitement but empty of truth. That phrase really strikes a chord. It suggests that meaning isn't just about doing stuff and achieving things. It is fundamentally about being real.
And I want to explore the actual sustainability of that bad meaning, the yes argument we talked about earlier. It largely focuses on the snapshot, the adrenaline in the exact moment of action. The no argument looks at the entire timeline of a human life.
Because lies are heavy to carry.
Incredibly heavy. Think about the massive cognitive load of maintaining a morally bad life. If you are a genuinely honest person, you don't have to remember your lies. Your reality is consistent and singular. If you are the villain, you are constantly managing a split reality. There is what actually happened, and there is what I told people happened.
And worse, there's what I tell myself happened.
That is the most exhausting one of all. To maintain the internal sense that you are a great man or a visionary while actively doing terrible things, you have to constantly perform exhausting mental gymnastics. I am not greedy, I'm just highly ambitious. I am not cruel, I am just the only one strong enough to make the tough calls.
That sounds like a 247 full-time job just living in your own head.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And this constant, desperate maintenance creates a profound fragility in the person. A morally good life is anti-fragile. It actually gets stronger under pressure because the truth is a solid foundation.
Right.
A morally bad life is extremely fragile. One tiny crack in the facade, one single moment where the guilt finally slips through the cracks or the big lie is publicly exposed, and the entire structure of their meaning just totally collapses.
So the villain's meaning is essentially just a giant house of cards.
Yes. It looks incredibly impressive and tall from a distance, but it cannot withstand the slightest wind of truth. The no side argues that true meaning absolutely must be resilient. It must be able to survive the light of truth. If your meaning completely evaporates the moment you are forced to be honest with yourself, it wasn't real meaning to begin with. It was just a delusion.
That perfectly connects back to the isolation point in the text, too. If your relationships are entirely based on power dynamics, they break the exact moment you lose that power.
Exactly. This is the third major argument against the villain having a meaningful life. Isolation. The whole lonely at the top trope exists for a very scientifically valid reason. Meaning is almost inextricably linked to human connection, love, deep friendship, mutual trust, shared burdens. A morally bad person who habitually treats others as mere tools or stepping stones creates a terrible paradox for themselves. They might be constantly surrounded by people, entourages, employees, adoring fans, but they are fundamentally deeply alone.
Because none of those people actually know them. They just know the power, or they know the money.
Or even worse, they are just afraid of them. If you rule your empire by fear, you don't have friends. You have hostages.
Whoa, you have no friends, you have hostages. That's a really powerful way to frame it.
And think about the actual quality of those relationships. You have allies of convenience who will absolutely stab you in the back the very second you show weakness. You have followers who are just waiting around for a financial handout.
It's all transactional.
Completely transactional. The villain has to be constantly exhausting paranoid. We see this with fallen tycoons and disgraced politicians all the time. The very moment the money or the influence stops, the phone completely stops ringing. And suddenly, they are left sitting there with absolutely nothing. No lasting legacy, no real friends, no inner peace. Just the fading memory of the rush.
And that is a truly tragic ending. To look back and realize you spent your entire life buying out the tickets to a show that everyone else eventually walked out of.
That is a brilliant analogy, and that brings us right back to why the no argument is so compelling to these philosophers. They aren't just being moral scolds or lecturing us. They're trying to practically warn us about the structural integrity of a bad life. They are essentially saying, do not build your house there. The ground isn't stable.
So we have a bit of a stalemate here, kind of. On one hand, the villain has intensity, absolute focus, and undeniable historical impact. On the other hand, they are living a fragile lie, completely disconnected from moral reality, and they are totally alone. How do the sources resolve this tension?
I think we resolve it by looking at a crucial distinction the texts make. We need to clearly separate subjective meaning from objective meaning.
Okay, break that distinction down for us. What's the difference?
Subjective meaning is simply how the life feels to the person actually living it. It is the strictly internal view. From the inside, the villain feels incredibly important. They feel exactly like the hero of a great epic. They wake up every day with a master plan.
Right.
So subjectively. Yes, they possess meaning.
But objective meaning is different.
Very different. Objective meaning is how that same life looks when viewed in the light of deeper values, universal truth, and the reality of other human beings. It is kind of like the God's eye view, or the view of history, or just the view of a truly wise, impartial observer.
Okay.
From that external angle, we judge their life projects as fundamentally destructive. We see their interpersonal relationships as incredibly shallow. We see their entire self-understanding as totally warped.
So, two things can actually be true at the exact same time. The villain deeply feels like they're living a meaningful life, but objectively speaking, they're tragically mistaken.
Exactly. It is exactly like someone who confidently thinks they are a virtuoso musician, but they are actually just banging on the keys, making terrible noise.
Right.
Subjectively, they're having an absolute blast. They feel the music, but objectively, they aren't making music at all.
That is a really helpful framework to wrap our heads around. It totally explains why we look at these ruthless people in the media and feel that weird sense of confusion. We clearly see their intense confidence, that subjective meaning, but we also intuitively feel in our gut that something is deeply wrong, the objective lack of meaning.
And this leads us to a really fascinating new concept in the material that I think bridges this exact gap perfectly. The philosophers suggest we shouldn't just lazily call these bad lives empty. That word doesn't actually fit the reality.
Yeah, a dictator's life isn't empty like a vacuum. It is packed full of stuff and events.
Exactly. So instead of empty, we can call it tragic meaning.
Tragic meaning. I really like the sound of that. It beautifully solves that rigid binary of meaningful versus meaningless. But can we get specific here without getting, dragged into modern politics? What does a tragically meaningful life look like in practical terms?
Sure. Let's look at a classic archetype from the biographies we reviewed. Think about the mad scientist archetype. Someone who is undeniably brilliant, completely obsessed with scientific discovery, but totally ignores human ethics to get the results.
Okay.
Maybe they actually make a massive breakthrough that cures a terrible disease, but they ruthlessly experimented on vulnerable people without consent to get that data.
Oh, that is incredibly complex because the impact is hugely positive. Millions get the cure, but the method they used was objectively evil.
Exactly. And their life was undeniably meaningful in the strict sense that it was highly consequential. They pushed science forward. They had a massive world-changing goal, but the meaning is permanently stained. It is tragic because we look at their life and say, imagine what you could have been and the legacy you could have had if you just had a conscience.
It is the complete wasted potential of the human soul, even if the intellect was utilized to its absolute maximum.
Precisely. Or let's take another example from the arts. We see this a lot in historical biographies of famous creatives. An artist who creates absolute masterpieces that bring profound joy to millions of people over centuries, but in their private life, they emotionally and physically abuse their spouse and their children.
Right. This is the classic separate the art from the artist debate we hear all the time.
Right. The artist's life absolutely had meaning. They birthed incredible beauty into the world that outlasted them. But their interpersonal, moral life was a blast of destruction for anyone close to them.
Yeah.
It is tragic meaning because the immense beauty and the profound horror are permanently intertwined in the exact same life story. We cannot accurately say their life was meaningless. The timeless songs or paintings literally exist. But we also cannot morally say it was a good life.
It seems like tragic meaning is basically what happens when you maximize just one single variable of human life, like raw talent or political power, and you completely zero out all the other variables, like kindness or morality.
That is a mathematically perfect way to put it.
Right.
A truly balanced, fully meaningful life actively tries to keep all the core variables, personal achievement, deep connection, and strong ethics in the positive. The tragic life spikes one single variable to absolute infinity and just lets all the others crash and burn.
And the real tragedy of it is that the giant spike usually draws us in as outside observers. We look at the massive spike in wealth or talent and say, wow, look at that incredible success. We completely ignore the crash in their moral variables until it's way too late.
Yes.
It's like vector theory in physics. The magnitude of their life is extremely high, but the direction is just totally wrong.
Perfectly put. Think of historical, fanatical leaders who pushed wildly destructive ideologies, or criminal geniuses who managed to reshape the economies of entire regions of the world. Their lives are incredibly thick with meaning. You literally cannot tell the historical story of their era without including them, but it is a very dark, incredibly tragic kind of meaning.
It acknowledges the undeniable power and impact they had without ever excusing the terrible morality.
Exactly.
Now, I want to pivot slightly for the last part of this deep dive, because people do actually change. We have been talking about the villain this whole time like they are just a static, unchanging character. But what happens if they actually wake up one day and realize what they've done?
This is the transformation arc, and it is exactly where this somewhat dark topic gets really profoundly hopeful.
Can real meaning actually grow out of massive moral failure?
Absolutely it can. In fact, the psychological texts point out that some of the most deeply meaningful lives in all of human history are specifically lives of radical redemption.
Let's talk about the actual mechanics of that redemption arc, because I think people listening right now might be reflecting on their own lives and feeling like, well, I've done some pretty bad things in my career or my relationships. Am I just permanently stuck with tragic meaning?
No, and that is the true beauty of the human capacity for narrative change. We are not static characters locked in a script, but the sources are clear. The transformation requires significantly more than just feeling bad about what you did.
Right. It's not just sitting around feeling guilty. Guilt is ultimately pretty passive.
Guilt can actually become a very selfish trap. You can sit there and wallow in your guilt for years and still be entirely self-absorbed. Oh, I am such a terrible person. Look at me suffering so much. That is still entirely about you.
So what is the actual active ingredient for a truly meaningful transformation?
It is radical responsibility and active repair. It is the hard pivot from saying, I am bad, to saying, I did real harm to others and I will dedicate my energy to fixing it.
That shift from a static identity to a dynamic action.
Yes. Think about someone who was, say, a massive corporate fraudster. The moment they finally decide to stop lying is the turning point, sure, but the real deep meaning comes when they start actively using their intimate knowledge of how fraud works to protect other vulnerable people.
Right.
They say, I know exactly how the con works from the inside out, so I'm going to teach you how to spot it before you get hurt.
They literally alchemize the bad experience into a tangible social good.
Alchemize is the perfect word for it. They take the heavy, toxic lead of their past actions and they actively turn it into the gold of wisdom for others. And here is what the research shows is most fascinating. Often, these redeemed people end up with a significantly deeper, richer sense of meaning than someone who was just effortlessly good by accident their entire life.
Really, because they had to actively fight for it.
Because they intimately know the alternative.
Right.
They vividly know the coldness of the moral shadow, so they appreciate the warmth of the light so much more. They possess what psychologists call a redemptive self-narrative.
A redemptive self-narrative.
Yes. Researchers have extensively studied this phenomenon. People who frame their life stories as actively overcoming their own deep flaws and failures tend to report the absolute highest levels of generative meaning. They have a burning desire to give back more to the next generation.
But does that totally erase the bad years? Does it wipe the slate clean?
It doesn't erase the facts of what happened, no, but it completely reframes them. The texts refer to this as retrospective meaning.
Retrospective meaning?
Right. The earlier morally bad period of their life isn't deleted, but it functionally becomes the necessary prologue to a much larger, more beautiful narrative of learning and redemption.
That is incredibly beautiful to think about. So the true meaning doesn't actually come from the bad acts themselves. It comes directly from the courageous act of facing them head on.
Precisely. The meaning here is entirely sourced from the truth. It comes from stepping out of the delusion and taking full responsibility. And this brings us all the way back to our main places. No argument from early, the idea that true meaning fundamentally requires truth. When the villain finally redeems themselves, they are finally stepping into the truth. They are finally acknowledging the inherent reality and dignity of other people. And that is exactly why redemption stories feel so incredibly universally meaningful to us as an audience.
Because they perfectly represent the ultimate alignment of that subjective intensity we talked about with objective goodness. They finally point the magnitude in the right direction.
Yes, they are finally playing the right game with the right rules.
So if you are listening to this right now and you think you have seriously messed up your own moral compass somewhere along the line, that is absolutely not the end of your story. That is literally just the main conflict in Act 2.
Exactly. Act 3 is where the real meaning is actively made. The pen is still firmly in your hand. You can start writing a redemption arc starting right this very second. And that incredible human potential for change is in and of itself a profound source of meaning.
That is incredibly empowering. It completely takes the doom and gloom out of the conversation.
It completely restores human agency. You are absolutely not defined by your past actions. You are defined by your current direction. And if you consciously orient that direction toward truth and genuine connection, you are actively moving toward a much fuller, much richer kind of meaning.
Man. So we have covered a massive amount of ground here today. We've gone all the way from the successful villain archetype to the deep split between subjective and objective meaning, into the fascinating idea of tragic meaning, and finally ending on the mechanics of redemption. It really feels like we have built a comprehensive map here.
A map of the moral landscape, yes. And I think it clearly shows that meaning isn't just a single binary destination you arrive at. It is a highly complex terrain. You can absolutely be standing on the peak of success, but completely surrounded by the dense fog of deceit. Or you can be deep down in the valley of redemption, actively climbing your way out into the light.
And the ultimate goal isn't just to blindly be on a peak. It is to be on a peak where the air is actually clear. where you can plainly see the truth and genuinely see other people. If we have to distill everything and give a final verdict to the listener, a bottom-line answer to our core question, what is it?
It is a nuanced answer, but based on all the material we've covered, I think it's the only intellectually honest one. If by meaningful you just mean intense, highly focused, and historically impactful, if you simply mean, did this person feel like they mattered to the plot, then yes.
Yeah.
Morally bad people can absolutely live meaningful lives. We have to boldly admit that reality. But if by meaningful you mean a life that is deeply in touch with universal truth, a life that respects the reality of others, and a life that is genuinely worthy of human admiration, then no. Absolute moral goodness is inextricably tied to that deeper, resonant kind of meaning.
So a life of absolute cruelty can be incredibly powerful, but it will always be fundamentally distorted.
Yes. It heavily relies on massive self-deception. It completely disconnects you from the warmth of others. It is, at its core, a tragically warped meaning. So, yes, bad people can have lives that are highly significant, sometimes tragically so, but the absolutely fullest, richest, most human meaning possible, that strictly requires a deep alignment with moral reality.
It requires connection.
It requires actively recognizing human dignity, relentlessly seeking the truth, and always remaining capable of personal growth.
That is the ultimate distinction right there. You can have a meaningful life as a bad person, but you cannot have a fullest meaningful life. You are artificially capped.
You are playing a much smaller, much sadder game, even if you look like you're winning it.
Wow. This has been really heavy, but in the absolute best way possible. It really forces you to look at your own daily goals totally differently.
It forces you to pause and ask why you are actually doing what you are doing. Are you chasing the pile of books or the knowledge inside them?
Exactly. And that is exactly where we want to leave you, the listener. We have a few questions for you to just mull over while you're commuting today or maybe doing the dishes tonight.
First question. What do you personally mean when you say a life is meaningful? Try to be brutally honest with yourself. Do you secretly just mean highly successful and intense? Or do you actually mean morally deep and connected?
Second question. Can you think of someone, maybe a famous public figure, or maybe even someone you know personally, whose life was incredibly meaningful, but in that specific, tragic, destructive way we discussed? How does that specific framework totally change how you view their legacy?
And finally, the big one, what specific kind of meaning are you actively aiming for in your own life right now? And is your current moral compass actually helping you get there, or is it secretly getting in the way of the success you think you want?
Deep questions for a deep dive. Thanks so much for unpacking all this heavy material with us today.
It was incredibly fascinating. Always a pleasure.
We will see you all next time on The Deep Dive.